I thought it was going to be just another awkward family dinner until my grandmother Dorothy walked through the front door after 15 years of silence. The moment she saw me struggling to pay my rent again, she asked the question that shattered everything I believed about my family. Why was I still throwing money away on a cramped apartment when she and my grandfather had put a beautiful downtown studio in my name years ago? My mother, Patricia, just smiled that cold smile I knew too well and said those words that changed my life forever. That place belongs to Alice now. Grandma stood up from her chair, her face turning pale with shock and anger, and demanded we open the door because she had something to show us that would expose the truth my family had been hiding from me for years. The autumn air carried a chill through our suburban Denver neighborhood as I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home. I had been dreading this dinner for weeks, knowing it meant another evening of subtle criticism about my life choices and not so gentle reminders about how much more successful my older sister Alice had become. At 25, I was barely scraping by as a freelance graphic designer, splitting my paycheck between student loans and the outrageous rent on my tiny studio apartment across town. Meanwhile, Alice lived mortgage-free in this gorgeous downtown loft, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows and exposed brick walls that made my cramped space look like a closet. Walking up the familiar stone pathway, I could smell Mom's pot roast through the kitchen window. The same meal she had been making for these monthly family gatherings since I was a kid, though the warmth I used to feel coming home had long since faded into obligation. Dad Robert was probably already in his recliner remote, in hand waiting for everyone to gather so he could deliver his usual lecture about responsibility and making smart financial decisions. The irony never escaped me that his idea of financial wisdom seemed to involve constantly reminding me how Alice had figured out the secret to success while I was still struggling to make ends meet. The front door opened before I could even knock, and Mom appeared with that perfectly practiced smile she reserved for company. She was wearing her best dress, the navy blue one with tiny pearls that she only brought out for special occasions, which struck me as odd for what should have been a regular family dinner. Her hair was styled more carefully than usual, too swept back in an elegant chignon that made her look younger than her 58 years. Something was different about tonight, though. I could not quite put my finger on what it was. Inside the living room had been cleaned to magazine perfection, not a single throw pillow out of place or coffee table book askew. The good china was set on the dining room table, along with the crystal glasses that usually stayed locked away in the cabinet, except for holidays. Dad emerged from the kitchen carrying a bottle of wine I had never seen before, something expensive looking with a French label that probably cost more than my grocery budget for the month. He greeted me with his usual firm handshake and that measuring look that always made me feel like I was falling short of some invisible standard. Alice had not arrived yet, which was typical since she had developed a habit of showing up fashionably late to everything over the past few years. Her absence left me alone with my parents' pointed questions about my career prospects and housing situation topics I had grown tired of defending. They meant well, I kept telling myself, but their concern always felt more like disappointment wrapped in parental worry. Why was I still renting when I could be building equity? Why had I not found a more stable job with benefits? Why could I not be more like Alice, who seemed to have everything figured out? The doorbell rang just as Dad was opening the wine, and Mom practically flew to answer it. I expected to see Alice standing there with some excuse about traffic or a last-minute work emergency, but instead, a woman I barely recognized stepped into the foyer. She was elegant and silver-haired, wearing a beautifully tailored coat and carrying herself with the kind of confidence that comes from years of experience. It took me several seconds to realize I was looking at my grandmother Dorothy, whom I had not seen since I was 10 years old. She looked exactly the same and completely different all at once. Her hair had gone completely white, but it was styled in a sophisticated bob that suited her perfectly. She'd always been tall, but now she carried herself with a regal bearing that made her seem even more imposing. Her blue eyes, the same shade as mine, were as sharp and intelligent as ever, though there were new lines around them that spoke of years spent in foreign places, doing things I could only imagine. She was tan in a way that suggested months spent in Mediterranean sunshine, and her clothes had that effortless European elegance that made everything else in the room look distinctly American. Mom and Dad seemed nervous in a way I had never seen before, fumbling over themselves to take her coat and offer her drinks. There was an awkwardness to their movements that suggested this reunion was not entirely welcome, despite the fancy dinner preparations. Dorothy accepted their hospitality graciously, but I caught something calculating in her expression as she surveyed the room, taking in details with the kind of attention someone pays when they are looking for evidence of something specific. When her gaze landed on me, though, everything changed. Her face went through a series of emotions too quick to catalog, starting with surprise and moving through confusion before settling on something that looked almost like relief. She approached me slowly as if she was not quite sure I was real, and when she spoke, her voice carried the faint accent of someone who had been living abroad for years. "You look so much like your grandfather did at your age," she said, reaching out to touch my face gently. "I had no idea you had grown up to be so beautiful." There was something in her tone that suggested she had not expected to see me here at all, which struck me as strange, since this was supposedly a family dinner planned in her honor. The conversation over dinner started normally enough, with Dorothy sharing stories about her life in Italy and France, the art galleries she had visited, and the small vineyard she had been helping to manage outside of Tuscany. She talked about learning to speak Italian fluently and the joy of waking up to sunrise over rolling hills covered in grapevines. Her life sounded like something out of a travel magazine full of adventure and culture and experiences that made my daily struggles with rent and client deadlines seem incredibly small by comparison. But as the evening wore on, I began to notice the way my parents kept steering the conversation away from certain topics. Whenever Dorothy asked specific questions about my life or my living situation, Mom would quickly change the subject, or Dad would launch into some tangent about work or the weather. They were protecting some kind of secret, though I had no idea what it could be or why it would involve me. The moment of truth came when Dorothy set down her wine glass and looked directly at me with those piercing blue eyes. "Florence, sweetheart," she said, her voice cutting through the careful small talk like a knife through butter. "I have to ask you something that has been bothering me all evening. Why on earth are you still renting some tiny apartment when your grandfather and I put that beautiful studio downtown in your name? What happened to the place we bought for you?" The silence that followed was deafening. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, and I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I had no idea what she was talking about. No one had ever mentioned any studio apartment, let alone one that was supposed to belong to me. I looked at my parents for explanation, but Mom just smiled that cold, practiced smile and delivered the words that would change everything. "That place belongs to Alice now," she said, as casually as if she was commenting on the weather. Dorothy stood up so fast her chair nearly tipped over backward. Her face had gone pale, then flushed red, with what I was beginning to recognize as fury. "Open the door," she said, her voice deadly quiet, but carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the room freeze. "Open it right now, and you will see exactly what I brought back from Europe to show you." Dorothy marched to the foyer where she had left a small leather suitcase, the kind of vintage luggage that suggested years of international travel. Her movements were sharp and deliberate, like someone who had been preparing for this confrontation for a long time. She unzipped the case with practiced efficiency and pulled out a manila folder thick with official-looking documents. The papers rustled as she spread them across the dining room table, pushing aside the good china without ceremony. I moved closer to see what she was showing us, my heart hammering against my ribs as I tried to process what was happening. The first document I could make out clearly was a property deed complete with official seals and notary stamps. My name was typed in bold letters across the top, Florence Marie Henderson. Below that were legal descriptions of a downtown Denver address I recognized as being in one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the city. This Dorothy said stabbing the document with her finger is the deed to 800 square feet of prime real estate that your grandfather and I purchased specifically for you 5 years ago. We put $50,000 down as a wedding gift for your future whenever that day might come. The monthly payments have been automatically deducted from our account in Tuscany for the past 5 years, never once missing a payment. She pulled out bank statements printed on European letterhead, showing a clear paper trail of monthly transfers to a Denver mortgage company. The amounts were staggering to someone like me who counted every dollar $1,200 per month for 60 consecutive months. I did quick math in my head and realized my grandparents had spent over $120,000 on a property I had never even known existed. Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair, loosening his tie like the room had suddenly become too warm. Mom maintained her composure, but I could see a muscle in her jaw twitching the way it did when she was trying to control her temper. They were caught in something, though I still did not understand exactly what. Dorothy continued pulling documents from the folder, each one more damaging than the last. Property tax records showed the taxes had been paid faithfully every year. Insurance documents proved the place had been properly maintained and protected. There were even receipts for minor repairs and maintenance, everything handled through a property management company that had been sending monthly reports to my grandparents in Europe. According to these reports, Dorothy said, her voice getting harder with each word, Florence has been living in this studio apartment for 3 years, ever since she graduated college. The management company has been sending us photos of her artwork displayed on the walls and updates about how happy she is with the space. We've been so proud of how well she was doing, finally having a stable place to build her life. I felt sick to my stomach as the implications started sinking in. Not only had I never lived in any downtown studio, but someone had been actively deceiving my grandparents for years, making them believe I was thriving in a space I had never even seen. The level of planning and coordination required for such an elaborate lie was staggering. Patricia, Dorothy said, turning to face my mother with an expression that could have frozen fire. Robert, I need you to explain to me right now why my granddaughter is sitting here telling me she knows nothing about this property while you just told me it belongs to Alice. Mom and Dad exchanged looks across the table, the kind of wordless communication that comes from decades of marriage and shared secrets. Dad cleared his throat and started speaking in the careful tone he used when he was trying to defuse a tense situation at work. Dorothy, you have to understand, he began, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture. I do not have to understand anything except the truth, she said. Start talking, and do not even think about lying to me. I may be old, but I am not stupid, and I did not spend 15 years building a business in Europe without learning how to spot deception. Mom finally spoke up, her voice taking on that defensive tone she used whenever she felt cornered. Dorothy, when you left for Europe, things were complicated here. Florence was going through a rebellious phase, making poor decisions, getting involved with the wrong people. We were worried about her judgment, concerned that giving her access to valuable property would not be wise. This was news to me. The rebellious phase she was referring to was apparently my decision to major in art instead of business, and my choice to pursue freelance work instead of seeking employment at Dad's insurance company. I had never been involved with wrong people, unless you counted my college boyfriend who played guitar and had the audacity to wear ripped jeans to family gatherings. So you decided to... What exactly? Dorothy asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Steal the property from her and give it to Alice without bothering to consult the people who actually bought and paid for it. Dad jumped in to defend the decision. We did not steal anything. We made a responsible parental choice to ensure the property would be properly managed and maintained. Alice has a stable career, a good head for business. She was the logical choice to oversee the investment until Florence matured enough to handle such a significant responsibility. Dorothy stared at him for a long moment, then pulled out another set of documents I had not noticed before. Bank statements, but these were different from the mortgage records. These showed rental income deposits, monthly payments of $1,800 being deposited into an account I did not recognize. Logical choice, Dorothy repeated slowly. So logical that Alice has been collecting $1,800 per month in rental income from tenants living in Florence's property. According to my investigation, she's been doing this for the past 3 years, which means she has pocketed over $60,000 in rent money that should have belonged to Florence. The room went dead silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. I felt like I was watching a movie about someone else's life because surely this level of betrayal could not be happening in my own family. My sister, who had always been the responsible one, the successful one, the one my parents held up as an example, had been living off property that rightfully belonged to me while I struggled to make rent every month. Dorothy was not finished. She pulled out copies of lease agreements signed by Alice as the property owner, authorizing short-term rentals to various tenants. Professional photographs showed the studio beautifully furnished and staged, clearly being marketed as premium temporary housing for business travelers and tourists. Your daughter, Dorothy said to my parents, has been running an unauthorized rental business using property that belongs to Florence, property that my husband and I have continued paying for while believing Florence was living there. Not only has she stolen $60,000 in rental income, but she has been committing fraud by representing herself as the legal owner. I found my voice for the first time since this nightmare had begun. "Where is Alice now?" I asked, though part of me was not sure I wanted to know the answer. Mom looked at the floor, suddenly very interested in the pattern on the dining room rug. "Your sister is staying at the studio tonight," she said quietly. "She's been living there since she broke up with her boyfriend last year." So not only had Alice been collecting illegal rental income from my property, but she had also been using it as her personal residence when it suited her. The magnitude of the betrayal was overwhelming, but Dorothy was still not done, revealing the extent of what had been hidden from me. She reached into the folder one more time and pulled out a thick stack of correspondence, letters, emails, and documents that told an even darker story than I could have imagined. "This is 3 years of communication between Alice and the property management company," Dorothy said. "Communication in which your sister has been representing herself as Florence Henderson, using your social security number and personal information to authorize changes to the property management agreement. She has not just been stealing rental income, she has been committing identity theft." The reality of what had been done to me hit like a physical blow. This was not just a family dispute over property or money. This was serious criminal fraud, the kind of thing that destroyed lives and sent people to prison. And it had been orchestrated by the people who were supposed to love and protect me. Dorothy gathered all the documents and slid them across the table toward me. "These are copies," she said. "The originals are in a safety deposit box, along with additional evidence I have been collecting since I started investigating this situation 6 months ago. Florence, that property is legally yours, and every penny of rental income Alice has collected belongs to you as well." I picked up the deed with trembling hands, staring at my name printed in official legal typeface. For the first time in my adult life, I owned something valuable, something that could change my entire financial situation. But the joy of that discovery was completely overshadowed by the devastating realization that the people I trusted most in the world had been lying to me for years. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke through my shock. Dorothy smiled grimly and began gathering the papers back into their folder. "Perfect timing," she said. "Alice is home." The front door opened with the familiar jingle of Alice's key ring, and I heard her voice calling out cheerfully from the entryway. "Sorry I am late. Everyone traffic was absolutely insane coming back from the studio. I hope you saved me some of that amazing pot roast." She appeared in the dining room doorway looking every inch the successful professional, wearing an expensive-looking blazer and carrying a designer handbag that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled in the kind of sleek bob that required regular salon maintenance, and her makeup was flawless despite supposedly having just finished a long day at work. Everything about her appearance radiated prosperity and success. Her confident smile faltered the moment she saw Dorothy sitting at the table. The color drained from her face, and she took an involuntary step backward as if she had seen a ghost. For several seconds, nobody moved or spoke, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Grandmother Dorothy Alice finally managed her voice higher than usual. "What a wonderful surprise! When did you get back from Europe? Mom and Dad did not mention you were coming to visit." Dorothy stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. "I arrived this afternoon, Alice. I thought it was time to check on my granddaughters and see how they were managing the generous gifts their grandfather and I provided for their futures." Alice glanced around the room, clearly sensing danger, but not yet understanding the full scope of what she was walking into. She attempted to maintain her composure, moving to give Dorothy a hug that was stiffly received. "That is so sweet of you," Alice said, though her voice was strained. "I hope Florence told you how grateful she is for everything you and Grandpa did for her. It really made such a difference in her life." "Actually," Dorothy replied, settling back into her chair with the satisfaction of a cat who had cornered a mouse. "Florence has not told me anything about the studio apartment downtown. In fact, she seems completely unaware that such a property exists. Perhaps you could enlighten us about why that might be." Alice's attempt at maintaining her facade began to crumble. She looked desperately at our parents for support, but they were both studying their hands like the secrets of the universe were written on their palms. Alice was on her own, and she knew it. "I think there might be some confusion," Alice said, laughing nervously. "Florence has been having some problems lately. You know how creative types can be. Sometimes reality and fantasy get a little mixed up. She probably just forgot about the apartment in all the stress of her current living situation." It was a masterful attempt at manipulation, painting me as unstable while positioning herself as the reliable family member who could be trusted with the truth. But Dorothy had not spent 15 years building a successful business in Europe without learning how to see through lies. "Forgot about it," Dorothy repeated thoughtfully. "How interesting. Because according to the bank records I have here, someone has been depositing rental income from that property into an account bearing your name and social security number for the past 3 years. She spread the financial documents across the table like playing cards, each one representing another nail in Alice's coffin. The bank statements clearly showed monthly deposits of $1,800 into an account that definitely did not belong to me. Alice stared at the papers for a long moment, and I could see her mind racing as she tried to come up with an explanation that would get her out of this situation. When she spoke again, her voice had taken on a pleading quality. "Dorothy, you do not understand the whole situation," she said. "I have been managing the property temporarily just until Florence got her life together. She's been struggling with addiction issues, making poor financial decisions. I was trying to protect the investment you and Grandpa made." Addiction issues. I stood up so fast my chair nearly fell over. "Alice, what are you talking about? I have never had addiction problems of any kind." Alice turned to face me with an expression of such practiced concern that I almost believed she was genuinely worried about my well-being. "Florence, honey. I know it is hard to admit, but your drinking has been out of control for months. The missed rent payments, the erratic behavior, the way you have been isolating yourself from the family. We have all been worried sick about you." This was a completely new level of manipulation. Alice was not just lying about the property, she was attempting to rewrite my entire recent history to support her narrative. The scary thing was how convincing she sounded, how readily the lie rolled off her tongue as if she had been practicing it for months. Dorothy reached into her folder and pulled out another set of documents I had not seen before. Bank statements, but these were different from the others. They showed regular deposits from an account in Italy transfers that had been coming in monthly for the past 3 years. "Alice," Dorothy said, her voice deadly calm. These are records of the monthly payments I have been sending to your parents to cover Florence's living expenses and medical bills. 36 payments of $850 each, totaling over $30,000 that I was told was going toward Florence's therapy and rehabilitation. The blood drained from Alice's face as she realized how deep the deception went. Not only had she been stealing rental income from my property, but my parents had been collecting money from Dorothy under the pretense of helping me with addiction treatment that I had never needed or received. Patricia Dorothy continued, turning to address my mother. You told me Florence was in an intensive outpatient program that she needed ongoing support to maintain her sobriety. You sent me updates about her progress photos of her looking healthy and happy at family gatherings. You even arranged for her to call me on my birthday last year to thank me for my support. I felt the world tilting around me as I tried to process what Dorothy was saying. Someone had been calling my grandmother, pretending to be me, thanking her for financial support I had never received, for treatment I had never needed. The level of planning and coordination required for such an elaborate deception was staggering. Alice made one last desperate attempt to control the narrative. Dorothy, I think you are confused about the timeline here. Yes, I have been managing the rental income, but only because Florence asked me to help her. She was overwhelmed by the responsibility of being a landlord, and she wanted someone more experienced to handle the business side of things. Dorothy opened her purse and pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind used for business meetings and interviews. She placed it on the table and pressed play. Alice's voice filled the room, crystal clear and unmistakable. Hi, Mrs. Chen. This is Florence Henderson returning your call about the studio rental. I'm so sorry for the confusion with the lease agreement. Yes, I can meet you tomorrow at 3 to go over the security deposit. The monthly rent is $1,800 due on the 1st of each month. Alice went completely still as her own voice continued playing, conducting what was clearly a business call with a prospective tenant. The recording was damning evidence that she had been actively representing herself as me in rental negotiations. How did you get that recording? Alice whispered, all pretense finally abandoned. Dorothy smiled grimly. I hired a private investigator 6 months ago when the stories about Florence started not making sense. Professional investigators have ways of obtaining information that grandmothers living in Tuscany do not. There are hours of recordings like this one, Alice. Hours of you conducting rental business using Florence's name and identity. She pulled out another device, this one a smartphone, and scrolled through what appeared to be a collection of voice recordings. The dates went back over 2 years, creating an undeniable pattern of identity theft and fraud. But that was just the beginning of what Dorothy had discovered. She reached back into the seemingly bottomless folder and pulled out a stack of photographs. Professional surveillance photos showing Alice meeting with various people outside the downtown studio, exchanging keys and what appeared to be cash payments. The investigator documented Alice's rental activities for 3 months, Dorothy explained. These photos show her conducting at least 12 different rental transactions, all while representing herself as the legal owner of property that belongs to Florence. This is not just family drama anymore. This is federal fraud. Alice collapsed into the nearest chair, her carefully constructed facade finally crumbling completely. The confident, successful woman who had walked into the room just minutes ago had been replaced by someone who looked small and frightened and cornered. I never meant for it to go this far, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It started out as temporary just until I could get back on my feet after the breakup. I was going to tell everyone the truth eventually. But Dorothy was not interested in Alice's excuses or justifications. She gathered all the documents and recordings back into her folder with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this moment for months. Alice, she said, her voice carrying the kind of finality that made it clear the conversation was over. You have stolen over $90,000 from this family through rental income fraud, and by intercepting money meant for Florence's supposed medical care. You have committed identity theft, mail fraud, and multiple counts of rental fraud. The temporary nature of your intentions does not change the criminal nature of your actions. I looked around the room at my family, seeing them clearly for the first time in my adult life. My parents, who I had always thought were simply disappointed in my choices, had been actively participating in a conspiracy to steal my inheritance. My sister, who I had envied for her success and financial stability, had built her comfortable life by systematically defrauding me and my grandparents. The worst part was not even the money, devastating as that loss was to someone in my financial situation. The worst part was the realization that everything I had believed about my family, about my place in their lives, about my own capabilities and worth, had been built on lies. Dorothy stood and picked up her folder. "Florence," she said, "we need to go see this property of yours, and then we need to discuss what you want to do about the people who have been stealing from you." Alice looked up at me with tears in her eyes, attempting one final manipulation. "Florence, please. We are family. Surely we can work this out without involving lawyers or police. I will pay back every penny, I promise. Just give me a chance to make this right." But I was done being manipulated, done being the convenient victim in everyone else's schemes, done accepting less than I deserved because I was too trusting to question the people who claimed to love me. "You should have thought about family loyalty," I said quietly, "before you decided to steal my future." Dorothy and I drove through downtown Denver in her rental car, a sleek sedan that smelled like leather and expensive perfume. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows between the buildings, and I found myself studying the familiar streets with new eyes, knowing that somewhere among these blocks was property that belonged to me. Property I had never seen, never benefited from, never even known existed until a few hours ago. As we navigated the one-way streets toward the address on the deed, Dorothy began filling in details that made the betrayal even more devastating than I had initially understood. She spoke in the measured tones of someone who had spent months investigating and documenting every aspect of the deception. "Florence," she said, keeping her eyes on the traffic ahead, "I need you to understand the full scope of what has been done to you. The rental income theft is just part of it. There are financial records going back 3 years, showing a pattern of fraud that involves not just Alice, but your parents as well. She reached into her purse and handed me a manila envelope I had not seen before. Inside were bank statements from the account where my parents had been depositing the monthly support payments Dorothy had been sending from Italy. $850 per month for 36 months. But the statements showed that money had not been used for any medical or therapeutic purposes. Instead, the funds had been transferred to various other accounts, mixed with Alice's rental income, and used for everything from car payments to vacation expenses. There were ATM withdrawals at casinos in Colorado and Nevada, online purchases from luxury retailers, and payments to what appeared to be investment accounts. My fictional addiction treatment had been funding my family's lifestyle improvements for 3 years. But there was more. Dorothy explained how she had become suspicious when the stories about my supposed problems began to contradict things she knew about my personality and character. The grandmother who had helped raise me until I was 10 years old remembered a responsible, creative child who had never shown any signs of addictive tendencies or self-destructive behavior. So 6 months ago, Dorothy had hired a private investigative firm that specialized in financial fraud cases. What they discovered was a conspiracy that went far beyond simple property theft. The investigators had documented a sophisticated scheme involving forged documents, identity theft, mail fraud, and what appeared to be money laundering through multiple accounts. "I started getting suspicious," Dorothy said as we turned onto a tree-lined street filled with converted warehouses and upscale lofts, "when Alice called me on your birthday last year. The voice sounded like you, but there were little things that did not seem right. She used expressions you never used as a child, pronounced certain words differently than you did. It was subtle, but it bothered me enough to start asking questions." What Dorothy discovered through her investigation was that Alice had not been making those calls herself. She had hired someone, an actress from a local theater company, to impersonate me during monthly check-in calls with Dorothy. The investigator had tracked down the actress and obtained recordings of Alice coaching her on details about my supposed life and recovery progress. The recordings were devastating evidence of premeditation and planning. Alice's voice could be heard instructing the actress on everything from my supposed therapy schedule to fabricated details about art projects I was supposedly working on as part of my healing process. The level of detail was impressive and horrifying in equal measure. Dorothy pulled into a parking space in front of a beautifully renovated brick building and handed me another set of documents. These were photographs and videos taken by the investigator over the past 3 months, showing the daily operations of Alice's illegal rental business. The images showed a parade of different tenants coming and going from the building, all of them apparently unaware they were renting stolen property. We got out of the car and approached the building entrance. Dorothy produced a set of keys from her purse, original keys that had been mailed to her in Italy when the property was first purchased. As we climbed to the 3rd floor, she continued explaining what the investigation had revealed. The most damaging evidence, she said, as we reached the door marked with the address from my deed, was what we found when we started tracing the rental income deposits. Alice has not been reporting this income on her tax returns, which means she has been committing tax fraud in addition to everything else. The IRS tends to take a very dim view of unreported rental income, especially when it involves identity theft. Dorothy turned the key and pushed open the door to reveal a space that took my breath away. The studio was everything Alice had never mentioned and more. Exposed brick walls, hardwood floors, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city skyline. The furniture was modern and expensive, clearly chosen to appeal to upscale temporary renters. Track lighting highlighted architectural details that transformed the industrial space into something that belonged in a design magazine. "This is yours," Dorothy said simply. "Every square foot, every brick, every window. Your grandfather and I chose this property specifically because we knew you would appreciate the artistic potential of the space." I walked through the studio in a daze, running my hands along surfaces that should have been familiar but felt foreign. The kitchen was small but efficiently designed with stainless steel appliances and granite countertops. The bathroom featured a clawfoot tub and vintage fixtures that had probably cost more than I made in several months. The main living area was large enough to serve as both living space and art studio, with north-facing windows that would provide perfect natural light for painting. But what broke my heart was not just seeing what I had been denied. It was imagining the life I could have built here, the art I could have created, the financial stability that would have allowed me to take creative risks instead of scrambling constantly just to pay rent. Alice had not just stolen money from me, she had stolen years of potential growth and peace of mind. Dorothy was examining something on the kitchen counter, her expression growing increasingly dark. "Florence," she called, "you need to see this." She was holding a stack of mail that had been left on the granite surface. Bills, promotional materials, and official-looking envelopes, all addressed to me at this address. Someone had been collecting my mail and sorting through it, probably looking for anything that might complicate Alice's rental operations. Among the correspondence was something that made my blood run cold. A notice from the Colorado Department of Revenue indicating that I owed back taxes on unreported rental income. According to the notice, the state had records showing I had been earning $1,800 per month in rental income for the past 3 years and had failed to report any of it on my tax returns. Alice had not just been stealing my rental income. She had been doing it in a way that made me legally liable for taxes on money I had never received. The notice indicated I owed over $12,000 in back taxes, plus penalties and interest for income that had been stolen from me. Dorothy examined the tax notice with the grim efficiency of someone who had been expecting exactly this kind of complication. "This is mail fraud in addition to everything else," she said. "Alice has been intercepting official government correspondence and failing to forward it to you. The penalties for that alone can include federal prison time." She pulled out her phone and began taking photos of everything in the apartment. The expensive furniture, the rental marketing materials left behind by previous tenants, the stack of intercepted mail, and particularly the tax documents that proved the scope of the financial damage that had been done to me. As we explored the studio further, Dorothy explained that the investigation had uncovered evidence of Alice's rental operations going back even further than the 3 years she had been collecting official income. There were records of under the table, rental arrangements, cash transactions that had never been reported to anyone, and what appeared to be short-term vacation, rental listings on multiple websites. The investigator estimates Dorothy said that Alice has collected over $100,000 in rental income from this property over the past 4 years. Some of it was reported to tax authorities under your name, making you liable for taxes on money you never received. Some of it was kept completely off the books, which constitutes tax evasion and money laundering. But perhaps the most devastating discovery was what the investigator had found when they started tracing the actress Alice had hired to impersonate me during phone calls. The woman had kept detailed notes about her conversations with Dorothy, including instructions Alice had given her about my supposed medical condition therapy progress and emotional state. According to those notes, Alice had painted a picture of me as someone who was deeply troubled, struggling with substance abuse, and potentially dangerous to myself and others. She had told Dorothy I was in and out of treatment facilities, that I had stolen money from family members to fund my addiction, and that I was too unstable to be trusted with financial responsibility. The cruelest part was that Alice had instructed the actress to express gratitude for Dorothy's support, to tearfully thank her for not giving up on me during my darkest moments. Dorothy had spent 3 years believing she was helping her granddaughter overcome serious problems, when in reality she was funding the comfortable lifestyle of the person who was destroying my financial future. Dorothy finished photographing the apartment and gathered the intercepted mail into a bag she had brought for that purpose. Every piece of evidence would be needed for the legal proceedings that were about to begin, and she had been methodical about documenting everything that could be used to prove the scope of Alice's crimes. As we prepared to leave the studio, I took one last look around the space that should have been my home for the past 3 years. The afternoon light streaming through those beautiful windows illuminated everything with a golden glow that made the theft of this opportunity feel even more devastating. But along with the sadness and anger, I was beginning to feel something else. A determination I had never experienced before, fueled by the realization that I had been systematically victimized by the people who were supposed to protect me. Alice had made a serious mistake when she decided to steal from someone who had a grandmother with the resources and determination to fight back. Walking back to the car, Dorothy handed me copies of all the documents the investigator had compiled: bank records, rental agreements, tax documents, surveillance photos, and recorded phone conversations. Everything needed to prove that Alice had committed multiple felonies and that my parents had been willing accomplices in the fraud. "Florence," she said as we drove back toward my childhood home, "I want you to understand that you have options here. We can handle this privately as a family matter and try to recover what was stolen through civil proceedings, or we can turn all of this evidence over to the authorities and let the criminal justice system handle it." I looked at the stack of documents in my lap, evidence of years of betrayal and theft, and realized that for the first time in my adult life, I held real power. The power to seek justice, to hold people accountable for their actions, to demand consequences for the damage that had been done to my life. The choice was mine, and for once I knew exactly what I wanted to do. We returned to my parents' house to find Alice pacing frantically in the living room, while Mom and Dad sat in strained silence on the couch. The atmosphere was thick with tension and barely controlled panic. Alice had clearly spent our absence trying to convince our parents to help her find a way out of the situation, but judging from their body language, those conversations had not gone well. Alice looked up hopefully when we walked in her eyes, searching my face for any sign that I might be willing to forgive and forget. What she saw there made her hope crumble into desperation. "Florence," she said, rushing toward me with her hands outstretched in a pleading gesture. "Did you see the studio? Is it not beautiful? I have been taking such good care of it for you, making sure it stays in perfect condition. I even had the hardwood floors refinished last year." Dorothy set her folder of evidence on the coffee table with a decisive thunk that silenced Alice mid-sentence. She had spent the drive back from downtown making phone calls to lawyers and law enforcement contacts, and her expression suggested those conversations had been very productive. Alice Dorothy said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made important decisions. "We found something very interesting at the studio. Would you like to explain why Florence has been receiving tax bills for rental income she never collected?" Alice's face went pale as she realized we had discovered the tax liability issue. "That was supposed to be handled by the property management company," she stammered. "I had no idea there were problems with the tax reporting." But Dorothy was not interested in more lies. She opened her folder and spread the intercepted mail across the coffee table like evidence in a criminal trial. Tax notices, legal documents, and official correspondence that painted a clear picture of systematic mail fraud. "This is not just about unreported income," Dorothy said. "This is about you intercepting official government correspondence and creating tax liability for someone else through identity theft. The IRS considers this a form of fraud that can result in federal prison time." She pulled out her phone and showed Alice a photo of something I had not noticed during our visit to the studio: a mailbox key hidden under a decorative plant near the building entrance, clearly placed there so Alice could access my mail without having official forwarding privileges. "My investigator watched you retrieve mail from Florence's mailbox on 3 separate occasions," Dorothy continued. "Federal law enforcement takes mail theft very seriously, especially when it involves tax documents and government correspondence." Alice slumped into a chair, the fight going out of her as she realized how thoroughly her activities had been documented. The confident manipulator who had tried to control the narrative just hours ago was gone, replaced by someone who looked cornered and desperate. But Dorothy was not finished revealing what her investigation had uncovered. She reached into her folder and pulled out what appeared to be rental listings printed from vacation rental websites. The photos showed my studio apartment being marketed for short-term stays, complete with professional photography and detailed descriptions of amenities. "Alice has been operating an illegal hotel business," Dorothy explained, handing me the printed listings. "She has been renting your property to tourists and business travelers through multiple online platforms, charging premium rates for short-term stays in what she describes as a luxury downtown studio." The rental rates listed on these websites were staggering. $300 per night for weekend stays, $250 per night during the week, with special holiday pricing that went even higher. Alice had been running a sophisticated vacation rental operation that generated far more income than traditional monthly rentals. According to the booking records my investigator obtained, Dorothy said Alice has been operating this business for over 2 years. During peak seasons, she was booking the studio almost every night, sometimes charging over $400 for special events weekends. I did the math quickly in my head and felt sick. If Alice had been charging $300 per night and booking the space even half the time, she could have been generating over $50,000 per year in rental income. Combined with the longer-term rentals and the money my parents had been collecting from Dorothy, Alice had stolen well over $200,000 from our family. But the vacation rental operation had created additional legal problems for Alice, beyond simple theft. Operating a commercial hotel business without proper licensing was a violation of city zoning laws and tax regulations. The investigator had documented at least 15 different violations of local ordinances, each one carrying substantial fines and potential criminal penalties. Dorothy pulled out another set of documents that made the situation even worse for Alice. These were communications between Alice and various online rental platforms, messages in which she represented herself as Florence Henderson, the legal owner of the property. Identity theft becomes a federal crime when it crosses state lines, Dorothy explained. Alice has been committing fraud against customers from other states and countries, using Florence's identity to conduct illegal business operations. The FBI has jurisdiction over this type of interstate fraud. Alice finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I never meant for it to get this complicated. It started as just temporary income, while I figured out what to do with my life after the breakup. I was going to tell everyone eventually. Dorothy stared at her with the kind of cold assessment that made it clear she had no patience for excuses or justifications. Alice. She said, "You have been systematically defrauding this family for over 4 years. You hired an actress to impersonate Florence during phone calls with me. You intercepted government mail and created tax liability for someone else. You operated an illegal business using stolen identity credentials. This was not a temporary mistake. This was an organized criminal enterprise." She reached back into her seemingly endless folder and produced what appeared to be financial records from Alice's personal bank accounts. The investigator had traced money through multiple accounts, documenting a pattern of deposits and transfers that showed Alice had been laundering rental income through various financial institutions. These records show over $300,000 in unexplained income over the past 4 years, Dorothy said. Income that was not reported on tax returns, income that cannot be accounted for through Alice's legitimate employment. The IRS has tools for dealing with people who try to hide this level of unreported income. Mom finally spoke up from her position on the couch, her voice shaky with what sounded like genuine fear. "Dorothy, surely we can work something out as a family. Alice will pay back everything she owes plus interest. We do not need to involve authorities in what should be a private family matter." But Dorothy had clearly moved beyond considering this a family dispute. She gathered her documents and stood with the decisive movements of someone who had made important decisions during our drive back from downtown. "Patricia," she said, addressing my mother with formal politeness that made it clear their relationship had fundamentally changed. This stopped being a family matter when Alice started committing federal crimes using Florence's identity. The mail fraud alone carries a potential sentence of up to 20 years in federal prison. She turned to address Alice directly, her voice carrying the kind of finality that made it clear negotiations were over. "Alice, my attorneys will be filing criminal complaints with the FBI, the IRS, and local law enforcement first thing Monday morning. The evidence is overwhelming, and the crimes you have committed are serious felonies that prosecutors take very seriously." Alice burst into tears, the reality of her situation finally sinking in completely. "Florence, please," she sobbed. "We are sisters. Surely you do not want to see me go to prison over money. I will pay back every penny, I swear. Just give me a chance to make this right." But I was done being manipulated by tears and appeals to family loyalty. Alice had made calculated decisions to steal from me for years while watching me struggle financially. She had created elaborate lies about my character and stability. She had stolen not just money, but years of opportunity and peace of mind. "Alice," I said quietly, "you had 4 years to make this right. 4 years during which you could have told the truth, returned the money, and asked for forgiveness. Instead, you doubled down on the lies and expanded your criminal activities. You made your choice." Dorothy handed me a business card for the law firm she had retained to handle the criminal and civil proceedings. The attorneys were specialists in financial fraud cases with experience prosecuting the kind of complex schemes Alice had been operating. "Florence," she said, "these lawyers will help you recover everything that was stolen from you, plus damages, for the financial harm Alice's crimes have caused to your credit and tax situation. They will also ensure that Alice faces appropriate criminal consequences for what she has done." As we prepared to leave, Dad made one last desperate attempt to minimize the severity of what had happened. "Dorothy," he said, "Alice is young and made some poor choices, but ruining her life with criminal charges seems excessive. Cannot we handle this with civil litigation and family counseling?" Dorothy looked at him with the kind of disappointment reserved for people who had fundamentally failed to meet basic standards of decency. "Robert," she replied, Alice is 29 years old, not a confused teenager. She committed premeditated felonies against her own sister for over 4 years. She hired actresses to deceive elderly relatives. She operated criminal enterprises using stolen identities. These are not poor choices. These are serious crimes that require serious consequences. She picked up her folder and headed toward the door, then paused to deliver one final message to my parents. Patricia and Robert, you were willing accomplices in defrauding me out of over $30,000 in financial support that was supposed to help Florence. My attorneys will be including you in the civil litigation to recover those funds, plus interest and damages. As we walked to the car, I felt a strange sense of lightness, despite the devastating nature of everything I had learned. For the first time in my adult life, I was not the victim of circumstances beyond my control. I had evidence, legal representation, and a grandmother with the resources and determination to fight for justice. Alice had made a fundamental miscalculation. She had assumed I would always be too trusting, too financially vulnerable, and too dependent on family approval to fight back against her manipulation. She had been wrong on all counts. The reckoning was about to begin. 3 days later, Dorothy and I returned to my parents' house, armed with legal documents and a plan that had been carefully crafted by some of the best criminal defense attorneys in Denver. The past 72 hours had been a whirlwind of meetings with lawyers, financial advisors, and law enforcement officials who had been very interested in the evidence Dorothy's investigator had compiled. The FBI had opened a formal investigation into Alice's activities, focusing particularly on the mail fraud and interstate commerce violations connected to her vacation rental business. The IRS had launched their own inquiry into the unreported income and tax evasion issues. Local authorities were pursuing charges related to operating an unlicensed commercial lodging business and violating zoning regulations. But before the full weight of the criminal justice system came down on Alice, Dorothy wanted to give her one final opportunity to confess everything and potentially cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. It was a generous offer, considering the scope of Alice's crimes, and one that our lawyers had warned might not be available once formal charges were filed. We found Alice exactly where we expected her to be, sitting at the kitchen table with Mom and Dad surrounded by legal documents and looking like she had not slept in days. Her usually perfect appearance was disheveled, her hair unwashed, and her clothes wrinkled. The confident professional facade had completely crumbled, leaving someone who looked desperate and defeated. Mom jumped up when we entered, immediately launching into a prepared speech about family forgiveness and second chances. Dorothy cut her off with a gesture that made it clear we were not there to negotiate or discuss emotional appeals. Alice, Dorothy said, settling into the chair across from my sister, my attorneys have prepared a detailed summary of the criminal charges you are facing. I thought you should understand the full scope of your legal situation before decisions are made about how to proceed. She placed a thick legal document on the table, then opened it to reveal page after page of criminal statutes and potential penalties: mail fraud, identity theft, tax evasion, operating illegal commercial enterprises, money laundering through multiple financial institutions. Each charge carried potential prison sentences measured in years, not months. The federal charges alone, Dorothy explained, carry a potential sentence of up to 35 years in prison. The state and local charges could add another 15 years to that total. Alice, you are looking at spending most of the rest of your adult life in federal prison if you are convicted on all counts. Alice stared at the legal document with obvious terror, the reality of her situation finally sinking in completely. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "What do you want from me?" Dorothy leaned back in her chair with the satisfaction of someone who held all the cards in a high-stakes negotiation. "Complete confession," she said. "Everything. Every crime you committed, every lie you told, every dollar you stole. Full cooperation with law enforcement and complete restitution to everyone you defrauded." She pulled out a small digital recorder and placed it on the table between them. In exchange for your complete confession and cooperation, my attorneys have negotiated a potential plea agreement that would limit your prison sentence to 5 years, with possibility of parole in 3. Alice looked around the table, desperately seeking support from our parents. That was not forthcoming. Dad would not meet her eyes, and Mom was crying quietly into her hands. They had finally realized that their daughter had committed serious crimes that could not be fixed with family discussions or emotional appeals. Alice, I said, speaking for the first time since we had arrived, this is your choice. You can confess everything now and accept responsibility for what you did, or you can fight the charges and risk spending decades in prison. But either way, the truth is coming out. Alice took a shaky breath and looked directly at me for the first time in days. If I confess, she said, will you forgive me? Can we still be sisters after this? It was the question I had been dreading because the answer was complicated and painful. Forgiveness was not the same thing as trust, and rebuilding a relationship after such fundamental betrayal would take years of work that I was not sure either of us was prepared to do. Alice, I replied carefully, I can forgive you for being desperate and making terrible choices, but I cannot forgive you for watching me struggle financially for years while you profited from stealing my inheritance. I cannot forgive you for lying to our grandmother and making her believe I was a drug addict. I cannot forgive you for committing crimes using my identity and potentially destroying my credit and tax standing. Dorothy pressed the record button on the digital device and nodded to Alice. Start from the beginning, she said. Tell us exactly how this started and how it escalated into the criminal enterprise you have been operating for the past 4 years. Alice looked at the recorder for a long moment, then began speaking in a voice that was flat and emotionless, like someone reciting facts they had memorized. It started about 4.5 years ago, she said. I had just broken up with my boyfriend Michael and needed a place to live quickly. I knew about the studio downtown because I had helped Mom and Dad handle some of the paperwork when Grandma and Grandpa first bought it. She paused, gathering herself before continuing with the devastating details. Florence was supposed to move in after she graduated college, but she decided she wanted to live with friends instead. Mom and Dad were worried about letting her have access to such valuable property when she was still figuring out her career path. This was news to me. I had never been offered the opportunity to live in any downtown studio after graduation. My parents had never mentioned that such an option existed, never given me the choice between the studio and sharing apartments with roommates. Alice continued her confession, each detail more damaging than the last. I suggested that I could move in temporarily and help manage the property until Florence was ready for that kind of responsibility. Mom and Dad thought it was a good idea, especially since I had a stable job and could handle the practical aspects of being a landlord. The lies were flowing easily now, as if Alice had practiced this version of events. But Dorothy was not interested in Alice's justifications or the narrative she had constructed to minimize her culpability. Dorothy interrupted Skip the explanations and focus on the criminal activities. When did you start collecting rental income that did not belong to you? Alice hesitated, then continued with the confession that would seal her legal fate. About 6 months after I moved in, I realized the studio would be perfect for short-term vacation rentals. The location was ideal, and I could charge premium rates for tourists and business travelers. She described how she had initially planned to share the rental income with me, but had decided I was too financially irresponsible to handle that kind of money responsibly. The rental income had started as just a few $100s per month, but had quickly grown into a substantial operation generating thousands of dollars in unreported income. When Dorothy started asking questions about my living situation, Alice continued, I panicked and told Mom and Dad that Florence was having problems with drugs and alcohol. I thought if I could make Grandma believe Florence was unstable, she would stop asking about the studio and sending money for expenses. The scope of the deception became clear as Alice described hiring the actress to impersonate me during phone calls with Dorothy. The actress had been coached extensively on details about my supposed addiction and recovery, creating elaborate fictional narratives about therapy sessions and medical treatment that had never occurred. I told the actress that Florence was too emotionally fragile to talk to family members directly, Alice confessed. I said she was embarrassed about her problems and preferred to have limited contact while she focused on recovery. Dorothy listened to the confession with professional detachment, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific transactions or timeline details. She was building a legal record that would be used in both criminal and civil proceedings, and she wanted every detail documented thoroughly. The confession continued for over an hour, with Alice providing a complete accounting of her criminal activities: the rental income theft, the tax evasion, the mail fraud, the identity theft, and the elaborate deception that had kept Dorothy sending money for fictional medical expenses. By the time Alice finished speaking, we had a recording that documented multiple federal and state crimes spanning over 4 years. Crimes that had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal income, while systematically destroying my financial stability and family relationships. Alice looked exhausted when she finally stopped talking, emotionally drained by the process of confessing years of criminal behavior. She stared at the table for a long moment before asking the question that had been hanging over the entire proceeding. "What happens now?" she whispered. Dorothy turned off the recorder and gathered the legal documents back into her folder. Now she said, "You wait to hear from prosecutors about whether they will accept your confession as the basis for a plea agreement. Your cooperation will be noted, but Alice, you need to understand that there will be serious consequences for what you have done." She stood and prepared to leave, then delivered a final message to Alice that carried the weight of absolute finality. "You destroyed your sister's financial future and stole years of opportunity from her while lying to elderly relatives who trusted you. Criminal prosecution is not just appropriate here, Alice. It is necessary to ensure this never happens to anyone else." As we left the house, I felt a complex mixture of sadness and relief. Sad for the loss of family relationships that could never be fully repaired, but relieved that the truth was finally out and justice was beginning to take its course. Alice had made her choices over the course of 4 years. Now she would have to live with the consequences of those decisions. 6 months later, I stood in the downtown studio that had finally become my home, watching the morning sun stream through those magnificent floor-to-ceiling windows I had dreamed about since the first day Dorothy showed me the property. The space had been completely transformed from Alice's illegal vacation rental operation into something that reflected my personality and artistic vision. The hardwood floors gleamed under track lighting I had installed to showcase the paintings that now lined the exposed brick walls. My easel stood in the perfect spot near the north-facing windows, surrounded by canvases in various stages of completion and art supplies that I could finally afford to buy without worrying about rent money. The kitchen counters displayed pottery pieces I had been commissioned to create orders that had started pouring in once I had the stability to focus on building my artistic career. The legal proceedings had unfolded exactly as Dorothy's attorneys had predicted. Alice had accepted a plea agreement that sentenced her to 4 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 2.5 years. She was also required to pay complete restitution, including the $230,000 in stolen rental income, the $31,000 in fraudulent support payments, and an additional $50,000 in damages for the financial and emotional harm her crimes had caused. The restitution payments had been structured to come from Alice's future earnings once she was released from prison, meaning she would be financially accountable for her crimes for years to come. The plea agreement also required her to surrender any professional licenses and prohibited her from working in financial services or property management for the rest of her life. My parents had faced their own consequences for their role in the conspiracy. They had been required to pay back all the money Dorothy had sent for my fictional medical treatment, plus interest and legal fees. More significantly, Dorothy had permanently severed her relationship with them, cutting off financial support they had been receiving and removing them from her will. The civil litigation had recovered everything that was stolen from me, plus substantial additional damages that had provided me with the financial foundation I needed to build a real artistic career. Between the recovered rental income, the settlement payments, and the value of finally having my own property, I had gone from financial desperation to genuine stability for the first time in my adult life. But the most important change had been in my relationship with Dorothy. She had decided to return permanently to the United States, purchasing a beautiful house just 10 minutes away from my studio. We had dinner together twice a week, and she'd become not just my grandmother, but also my closest friend and strongest supporter. Dorothy had also introduced me to other artists in the Denver community, helping me build professional networks and artistic connections that had led to gallery showings and commission opportunities. Having a stable living situation and the financial breathing room to take creative risks had transformed my work in ways I never could have imagined when I was struggling to pay rent every month. The studio had become exactly what Dorothy and my grandfather had envisioned when they purchased it for me 5 years ago, a space where I could live and work, where I could build both my artistic practice and my personal life without the constant stress of financial insecurity. I had also been able to establish a proper emergency fund invest in retirement accounts and even start planning for future goals like advanced art education and travel to study techniques in other countries. The stability Alice had stolen from me for 4 years was finally mine, and I was making the most of every opportunity it provided. There had been moments of sadness and grief throughout the legal process, times when I mourned the loss of family relationships that had been built on lies and manipulation. But I had come to understand that real family relationships require honesty, trust, and mutual respect. The connections I had lost with Alice and my parents had never possessed those qualities, while my renewed relationship with Dorothy was built on all of them. The art gallery opening I was preparing for represented the culmination of everything I had worked toward since reclaiming my property and my life. Local art critics were already talking about my upcoming show, and several pieces had been pre-sold to collectors who appreciated the emotional depth and technical skill of work created from a place of genuine personal growth. Standing in my kitchen making coffee that morning, I reflected on the life lesson that had emerged from the most difficult period of my life. Sometimes the people closest to us can become our greatest obstacles, not because they mean us harm, but because they have decided they know what is best for us better than we do ourselves. Real love and support require trusting people to make their own choices and face their own consequences, not manipulating situations to produce outcomes that others think we should want. Alice's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also taught me invaluable lessons about standing up for myself, demanding accountability from people who claim to love me, and recognizing the difference between genuine support and controlling manipulation. I had learned that fighting for justice was not about revenge, but about ensuring that actions have consequences and that truth matters more than family harmony. Dorothy had shown me what real family support looked like. She had used her resources and determination to investigate suspicious circumstances, gather evidence of wrongdoing, and ensure that justice was served. But more importantly, she had done all of that while respecting my autonomy and supporting my decisions about how to handle the situation. The morning sun was reaching the perfect angle for painting when my phone rang. It was the gallery owner calling to confirm final details for the opening reception that would launch my professional artistic career in Denver. As I discussed logistics for displaying my work, I looked around the studio that had finally become my sanctuary and creative laboratory. Everything I had lost through Alice's betrayal had been returned to me with interest, but more importantly, I had gained the confidence and self-respect that came from refusing to be anyone's victim. I had learned to fight for what belonged to me, to demand truth from people who claim to care about me, and to build my life on foundations of honesty and mutual respect, rather than family obligation and financial dependence. The studio apartment was beautiful, but it was just the beginning of what I was going to build with the opportunities that should have been mine all along. As I prepared my canvases for another day of productive work, I thought about the question I had been asking myself since the legal proceedings began. How many people are living diminished lives because they are too trusting, too afraid of conflict, or too dependent on family approval to fight back against manipulation and theft? If my story resonates with you, I would love to hear about your own experiences with family betrayal or standing up for yourself when it mattered most. Have you ever discovered that people you trusted were working against your best interests? How did you find the courage to demand accountability and fight for what belonged to you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and please like this story if it helped you think differently about family loyalty versus personal justice. Subscribe for more stories about overcoming betrayal and building authentic relationships based on honesty and respect. And if you know someone who might benefit from hearing about the importance of standing up for themselves, please share this story with them. Thank you for listening to my journey from victim to victor. I hope it inspires you to never settle for less than you deserve, and to remember that real love requires truth, even when that truth is difficult to hear. May you always have the courage to fight for what belongs to you, and the wisdom to recognize the difference between genuine support and controlling manipulation.